I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The annual Chipping Cleghorn Amateur Dramatic Society's summer pantomime was, as usual, the talk of the village. This year's production, a rather ambitious rendition of Puss in Boots, promised to be particularly memorable, largely due to the unexpected casting of Mr. Humphrey Blenkinsop, the notoriously reclusive retired solicitor, in the role of the ogre. His booming voice, usually reserved for scolding stray cats, was surprisingly well suited to the part, and a ripple of excited anticipation had swept through the audience gathered in the village hall. Miss Marple, ensconced in her usual seat in the third row, observed the scene with her customary quiet attentiveness. She noted the anxious flutter of Mrs. Bantry's fan, the slightly too bright smile on young Lucy Islesborough's face as she served tea in the interval, and the way the vicar, Mr. Clement, kept adjusting his spectacles as if to better scrutinize the programme. It was a picture of perfect English village life, bathed in the soft glow of the stage lights, smelling faintly of lavender and damp wool. The second act was well underway, building to the grand finale where Puss, with a flourish, was to outwit the ogre. The stage was plunged into darkness for a crucial scene change, a low murmur filling the hall as props were shifted backstage. A moment of slightly extended darkness passed, then another. A nervous cough broke the silence. The murmur grew into an uneasy rustle. Suddenly, a piercing shriek tore through the air, silencing every whisper. It was Miss Weatherby, the formidable director, her voice, usually as steady as a church bell, now shrill with terror. The stage lights flickered on erratically, revealing not the triumphant Puss, but a chaotic scene. Backstage, half obscured by a velvet curtain that had fallen awkwardly, lay Mr. Blenkinsop, still in his green ogre costume, his face a ghastly shade of blue. A small, ornate dagger, clearly a prop from the play, protruded from his chest. A collective gasp swept through the hall, followed by a stunned silence so profound that the distant bleating of a sheep seemed deafening. Miss Marple, though startled, remained outwardly calm, her knitting needles resting idly in her lap. Her eyes, however, missed nothing. The immediate pallor that spread across Mrs. Bantry's face, the way Lucy Islesborough dropped the tray of tea with a clatter, and the curious, almost calculating glance that passed between Colonel Melchett, the local chief constable, and his wife. The annual pantomime had indeed become memorable, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. The curtain had fallen, not on a triumphant hero, but on a dead man. The village hall of Chipping Cleghorn, usually a place of joyous communal gatherings and mild-mannered disputes over flower show prizes, was instantly transformed into a theatre of cold, sharp dread. The local doctor, Haydock, was the first to scramble onto the stage, his black medical bag appearing as if by magic. He knelt beside the prostrate figure of Humphrey Blenkinsop, his hands moving with efficient speed. After a mere moment he looked up at the gathered crowd, his face grim, and gave a slight, definitive shake of his head. The ogre would not be waking up for the final curtain call. By the following morning the village was a beehive of whispered conversations and nervous glances over garden hedges. Gossip in a small English village travels faster than a summer gale, and Chipping Cleghorn was no exception. At the Blue Boar the publican leaned heavily over the counter, discussing the tragedy with anyone who would listen. "Mark my words," he muttered to a group of hushed regulars. It was an outsider, someone who knew the hall and stage darkness changed. No one from around here would have the stomach to stick a dagger in old Humphrey, no matter how much of a nuisance he was with those legal threats of his. The theories were as varied as they were flawed. Miss Hartnell, clutching her string bag tightly as she stood in the queue at the post office, was certain it was a case of mistaken identity. She loudly proclaimed to Mrs. Weatherby that the blow was surely meant for the young man playing Puss, who had recently inherited a modest sum from a distant aunt. "Greed, my dear," she whispered. "It brings out the absolute worst in the younger generation. Poor Mr. Blenkinsop was simply in the wrong costume at the wrong time." Across the street at the local tea room the mood was equally speculative. Mrs. Bantry sat with Miss Marple, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred her Earl Grey. "It's simply dreadful, Jane," she breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and excitement. "The police are questioning everyone who was backstage. They seem to think it must be one of the cast. Can you imagine? Little Tommy Williams or that sweet Lucy Islesborough. It's unthinkable." Miss Marple, however, remained characteristically composed, her blue eyes mild and observant. She listened to the torrent of theories with the patient air of one watching a familiar play. She knew that in a village like this, everyone had a secret, a small tucked-away resentment or a long-forgotten grievance. To the casual observer, the villagers were a cohesive unit, but Miss Marple saw them as a collection of individuals, each with their own history and motivations. "People are so very much the same everywhere, Dolly," Miss Marple said gently, her voice barely a whisper above the clink of teacups. "It reminds me so much of the time the churchwarden's daughter disappeared in St. Mary Mead. Everyone assumed she had run off with the travelling salesman, but it turned out to be something quite different altogether, something much more local and, I'm afraid, much more premeditated. One must look past the obvious, you see. The obvious is often just a screen painted by someone very clever." As the day progressed, the village's initial shock began to crystallize into a more focused suspicion. The police, led by the diligent but perhaps too literal-minded Inspector Craddock, had begun their formal inquiries. They were particularly interested in the prop dagger. It was a distinctive piece, an antique that had been donated to the society years ago. The fact that it was used suggested a crime of opportunity, but Miss Marple wondered if the opportunity had been meticulously created. She noticed the way the vicar's wife avoided eye contact when the subject of Mr. Blenkinsop's recent legal battles was raised. She observed the slight nervous twitch in the hands of the young man who had been operating the stage lights, and she didn't miss the way the village postmistress seemed to have a sudden, intense interest in the mail arriving for the Blenkinsop estate. To the rest of Chipping Cleghorn, these were merely the reactions of a shocked community. To Miss Marple, they were the first threads of a complex web that she was only just beginning to untangle. She sat in her garden later that afternoon, her knitting needles clicking a steady rhythm, her mind already sifting through the layers of village life, looking for the one truth that remained hidden behind the facade of ordinary country folk. Inspector Craddock arrived at the village hall with a weary determination that Miss Marple had seen in many policemen before him. He was a man of facts, figures, and footprints, possessing a mind that functioned like a well-oiled filing cabinet. To him, the murder of Humphrey Blenkinsop was a logistical puzzle, who had been in the wings during the blackout, who had access to the prop room, and whose fingerprints might be found on the hilt of that antique dagger. He spent the morning sequestered in the small committee room, calling in the cast and crew one by one, while a constable stood guard at the door, looking rather out of place among the stacked chairs and dusty bunting. Outside, the sun shone with an almost insulting brightness on the village green. Miss Marple sat on a bench under the great oak tree, her knitting in her lap, appearing to the world as nothing more than a frail old lady enjoying the morning air. In reality, she was positioned perfectly to watch the arrivals and departures from the hall. She saw young Jerry Burton, the stagehand responsible for the lights, emerge from his interview looking decidedly shaken, his face a pale mask of anxiety. He lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, a habit Miss Marple knew his mother strictly forbade. Next came Miss Weatherby, the director. She walked with a stiff, upright posture, her chin held high as if she were facing a firing squad rather than a police inspector. When she passed Miss Marple's bench, the elderly lady noticed a slight, telltale smudge of grease paint on the director's cuff, a vivid green that matched the ogre's costume. It was a small thing, perhaps nothing more than the result of her discovering the body, yet Miss Marple filed it away in her mind. It reminded her of the time the local grocer in St. Mary Mead had claimed he hadn't touched the till, while a faint trace of peppermint from the counter jars remained on his thumb. The inspector's early investigation quickly centered on the logistics of the blackout. It had lasted exactly 42 seconds, longer than the planned 30. In those extra 12 seconds, the theatre had been a vacuum of sight, a perfect window for a silent approach and a swift retreat. Craddock's notes were filled with the names of those backstage, the puss actor, the stage manager, the lighting boy, and Miss Weatherby. Each had a reason to be there. Each claimed to have seen nothing and heard only the rustle of the curtains. However, Miss Marple was more interested in the why than the how. She knew that a man like Humphrey Blenkinsop did not get murdered simply because someone found a knife. He was a man of litigious habits, a retired solicitor who had spent his golden years making life difficult for his neighbours over property boundaries and ancient rights of way. She began to think of the many small irritations that could fester into a murderous rage. There was the matter of the vicarage roof, which Blenkinsop had claimed encroached upon his land, and the dispute over the public footpath that ran through his orchard. "It is quite remarkable," she murmured to herself as her needles clicked, "how a very small grievance can grow if it is watered by a sense of injustice." She recalled a similar case involving a missing prize-winning marrow and a very sharp garden hoe. People often thought that murder required a grand, operatic motive, but Miss Marple knew that most crimes were committed for much more mundane reasons: fear, spite, or the simple desire to be left in peace. As the inspector concluded his initial round of questioning, a rumour began to circulate through the village that a stranger had been seen near the back entrance of the hall just before the performance. This mystery man was described as wearing a dark mackintosh and a slouch hat, the classic attire of a theatrical villain. Villagers took the news in relief. It was far more comforting to believe in a shadowy intruder than to suspect the person who lived next door or the girl who served them bread. Miss Marple, however, remained sceptical. A stranger in Chipping Cleghorn was as conspicuous as a peacock in a poultry yard. If someone unfamiliar had been lurking about, half the village would have known their shoe size and the brand of their tobacco within 20 minutes. No, the answer lay within the familiar circle of the Amateur Dramatic Society. She watched as Inspector Craddock left the hall, his face set in a frown of frustration. He was looking for a criminal, but Miss Marple was watching people. She was sifting through the layers of village life, waiting for the one inconsistency that would reveal the wolf among the sheep. The machinery of official justice moved with a predictable, heavy-footed rhythm that Miss Marple had observed many times before. By late afternoon, the atmosphere in Chipping Cleghorn had shifted from generalized anxiety to a pointed, collective finger-wagging. Inspector Craddock, pressured by the chief constable and the sheer public nature of the crime, felt he had found his man. The obvious suspect had emerged, and his name was Jerry Burton, the nervous young man in charge of the stage lighting. The evidence, at least on the surface, appeared damning in that tidy, circumstantial way that so often satisfies the police. It was discovered that Jerry had been in a state of considerable financial distress, having accumulated several gambling debts that he had desperately tried to hide from his widowed mother. More significantly, a witness had come forward, the village gossip, Miss Hartnell, claiming she had overheard a heated argument between the boy and Mr. Blenkinsop just days before the play. The retired solicitor had apparently discovered Jerry's indiscretions and was threatening to inform the boy's employers at the local bank. To a young man of Jerry's precarious social standing, such a revelation would have been professional and social suicide. When a search of the lighting booth revealed a blood-stained handkerchief tucked behind a fuse box, Inspector Craddock felt the case was as good as closed. The boy's explanation, that he had cut his hand on a sharp wire and panicked at the sight of the police, sounded like the weak, fumbling excuse of a guilty amateur. Jerry was taken down to the station for further questioning, leaving his mother in a state of hysterical collapse and the village in a state of grim satisfaction. The troubled youth was a narrative the villagers understood and accepted. It was far more palatable than the alternative of a cold-blooded killer hiding behind a respectable middle-aged face. Miss Marple, however, remained profoundly unconvinced. She spent the evening in her small sitting room, her knitting draped over her lap, though the needles remained still. She was thinking of a similar incident many years ago in St. Mary Mead involving a young postman and a missing pension book. The evidence had been just as neat, yet the truth had lain in a completely different direction, involving a very quiet woman who liked to garden in the middle of the night. Neatness, Miss Marple knew, was often a sign of arrangement rather than reality. "It is all very convenient, isn't it?" she remarked to Mrs. Bantry, who had dropped by for a restorative glass of elderberry wine. "The motive is there, the opportunity is there, and even the bloody cloth is found exactly where a policeman would look. It reminds me of the way Mr. Henderson used to set out his prize dahlias, all in a row, perfectly spaced and entirely too artificial to be natural." Mrs. Bantry blinked, her glass poised mid-air. "But Jane, the boy was seen arguing with him, and Humphrey was the hardest man. He delighted in holding people's secrets over their heads. If Jerry was desperate, surely it's possible." "Oh, it is certainly possible, Dolly," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But is it possible? A boy like Jerry, for all his foolishness with horses and cards, is not a boy of iron nerves. To step out into a pitch-black stage, navigate the scenery, find the exact location of a man in a bulky costume, and deliver a fatal blow with a prop dagger, all in 12 seconds, requires a level of cold-blooded precision that I simply do not see in him. He would have fumbled, he would have made a noise, or he would have fainted dead away before the deed was done." Miss Marple's mind turned instead to the nature of the victim. Humphrey Blenkinsop had been a man who collected grievances like some people collect stamps. He was a solicitor by trade, and even in retirement he had kept a firm grasp on the legal tangles of the village. He knew who owed what to whom, which boundaries were disputed, and which wills were being contested. If he was threatening Jerry Burton, it was highly likely he was threatening others as well. The question was not who had a motive, but rather who among the many people with a motive possessed the specific type of character required to kill with such theatrical efficiency. She thought of the smudge of green grease paint she had seen on Miss Weatherby's cuff. She thought of the vicar's wife and her sudden, uncharacteristic silence. Above all, she thought of the prop dagger itself. It was an antique, yes, but it was also a stage tool. It had been handled by many, but it belonged to the world of make-believe. To use it as a real weapon was a choice that spoke volumes about the killer's mind. It suggested someone who saw the world as a stage, and the people in it as mere players to be moved or removed at will. As the clock on the mantel struck 10, Miss Marple picked up her needles once more. The police were satisfied. The village was settling into a false sense of security, but the real hunt, she knew, was only just beginning. The following morning, the village of Chipping Cleghorn seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, though it was a heavy, uneasy sort of respiration. With Jerry Burton safely under lock and key at the county police headquarters, the residents felt the immediate threat had passed. Life began to resume its outward appearance of normalcy. The baker delivered his loaves, and the milkman made his rounds, yet the conversations at every doorstep remained centred on the tragedy at the hall. Miss Marple, however, did not share this communal satisfaction. She felt a persistent, nagging itch of doubt, the kind one experiences when a piece of knitting just will not sit straight despite every row being counted. She decided that a walk was necessary, ostensibly to collect some specific wool from the haberdashery, but in truth, her feet led her back toward the village hall. The building sat silent and somewhat forlorn in the morning light, the colourful posters for Puss in Boots now appearing garish and misplaced. The side door had been left unlocked for the cleaning woman, Mrs. Rogers, who was currently engaged in a spirited battle with the dust of the previous night's chaos. Miss Marple slipped inside with the practised unobtrusiveness of a shadow, offering a gentle smile and a sympathetic remark about the state of the floorboards, while Mrs. Rogers grumbled about the muddy footprints left by the constabulary. Miss Marple wandered toward the stage. She stood exactly where the ogre had fallen, looking up at the heavy velvet curtains and the tangled ropes of the fly system. To the police, this was a crime scene, To Miss Marple, it was a social map. She moved toward the wings, her eyes scanning the floor not for bloodstains or fingerprints, but for the trivialities of human presence. It was there, tucked into the narrow crevice between a wooden support beam and a stack of painted backdrops, that she saw it, a small glinting object that the police's powerful torches had somehow missed. She stooped down, her joints protesting slightly, and retrieved a small circular piece of blue glass. It was no larger than a coat button, but it was not a button, it was a costume jewel, the sort used to decorate the lavish tunics of theatrical royalty. Miss Marple held it up to the light, her mind immediately racing back to the dress rehearsal she had watched from the back of the hall 2 days prior. She remembered the costumes vividly. The ogre wore green, Puss wore grey and white, and the king, played by the local draper, Mr. Smedley, had a magnificent robe of crimson adorned with dozens of these very same blue stones. However, the king had not been on stage during the blackout. According to the script and the testimony given to Inspector Craddock, Mr. Smedley had been in the dressing room at the far end of the corridor, nursing a sudden and poorly timed bout of indigestion. If the jewel had fallen from his costume, it had no business being in the wings, near the spot where Humphrey Blenkinsop had met his end. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the nature of costumes. They were shells, garments that could be stepped into and out of with remarkable ease, especially by someone familiar with the frantic pace of amateur dramatics. She sat on a nearby prop crate, turning the blue glass over in her palm. It reminded her of a case in St. Mary Mead involving a choir boy's missing surplice. Everyone had looked for a thief, but she had looked for a reason why a surplice would be moved at all. In this instance, the jewel suggested a presence that had been disguised. If someone had donned a portion of the king's costume, or perhaps handled it roughly in the darkness, they might have left this silent witness behind. But why the king? And why leave such a trail? The answer, she suspected, lay in the visual confusion of a darkened theatre. In the dim, filtered light of the wings, a tall figure in a heavy robe might be mistaken for almost anyone, or might be ignored entirely as just another actor moving to their mark. She also noted something else, a detail so minor it would have seemed absurd to the inspector. On the dusty floor near the jewel, there was a faint, circular indentation, as if a heavy, rubber-tipped cane had been pressed firmly into the wood. Mr. Blenkinsop did not use a cane, and neither did young Jerry Burton. Miss Marple tucked the blue jewel into her pocket with a thoughtful expression. The obvious evidence against the boy was looking more and more like a carefully constructed stage set, designed to draw the eye away from the true actors in this tragedy. She realized that the murder was not a sudden burst of temper from a desperate youth, but a choreographed performance. The choice of prop dagger was no accident, it was a thematic touch. As she walked back out into the sunlight, she felt the first stirrings of a new theory. The secret did not lie in Jerry Burton's gambling debts, but in the legal files of the man who lay dead, and the person who knew exactly how to use the shadows of the theatre to settle a very real account. The discovery of the blue glass jewel acted as a catalyst for Miss Marple's private inquiries, leading her away from the physical stage and toward the more complex theatre of village history. She spent the afternoon making a series of seemingly social calls, the kind that involved a lot of tea and a deceptive amount of listening. Her first stop was the vicarage, where she found Mrs. Clement in the garden, looking uncharacteristically frazzled. The vicar's wife was usually the picture of serene domesticity, but today her shears were clipping at the rose bushes with a rhythmic, aggressive snap that suggested a mind burdened by more than just aphids and black spots. "It is the uncertainty, Jane," Mrs. Clement confessed, pausing to wipe her forehead with a gloved hand. "The police seem so sure of that poor Burton boy, but the village feels different. It's as if everyone is looking at their neighbours and wondering what else they might be capable of." Humphrey was a difficult man, we all know that. But he was a pillar of the community in his own abrasive way. To think someone sat in our pews and then did such a thing is quite chilling. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes following the movement of the shears. He was indeed a man of firm convictions. I believe he was particularly firm regarding the new parish hall extension, was he not? I heard some talk of a legal injunction he was preparing. Mrs. Clement's face tightened. He was threatening to block the entire project over a dispute regarding the drainage pipes. It sounds trivial, but it would have bankrupted the building fund. My husband was devastated. He spent 5 years raising that money. This was a motive, Miss Marple noted, not for the vicar himself, who was a saintly if bumbling man, but for the preservation of a life's work. Yet, as she watched Mrs. Clement, she felt that the woman's agitation was born of something more personal than parish finances. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple made her way toward the home of Miss Weatherby, the director of the play. The house was a shrine to the dramatic arts, filled with framed programs and fading photographs of London stage stars. Miss Weatherby was in her study, surrounded by the scripts of past triumphs. She was a woman who lived for the spotlight, even if it was only the localized glare of the chipping Cleghorn Village Hall. When Miss Marple mentioned the beauty of the costumes, particularly the King's crimson robe, the director's professional pride momentarily masked her grief. It was a masterpiece of reconstruction, Miss Weatherby said, her voice dropping into its theatrical register. Though I must say, Mr. Smedley was quite a trial. He insisted on having the robe altered 3 times. He claimed the weight was too much for his heart, though I suspect he simply wanted it to taper more at the waist. He was in and out of the costume shop constantly during the final week. "And the jewels?" Miss Marple asked innocently. "They seemed so securely fastened." Miss Weatherby sighed. "They were, until the final dress rehearsal. I found several of them loose in the costume trunk. I had to ask Lucy Islesbarrow to sew them back on. She's so clever with a needle, though she seemed quite distracted lately. Young love, I suppose, or the lack of it." This mention of Lucy Islesbarrow, the capable and widely liked young woman who helped everyone in the village, added another layer to the tapestry. Lucy was known for her efficiency and her discretion, but she was also someone who saw into the private lives of every household she assisted. She had been working for Humphrey Blenkinsop twice a week, filing his correspondence and organizing his chaotic library of legal papers. As Miss Marple walked home, she reflected on the secrets that were beginning to surface like bubbles in a simmering pot. The vicar's fund, the director's obsession with perfection, Mr. Smedley's vanity and Lucy's proximity to the victim's private papers, all were threads leading back to the ogre. Humphrey Blenkinsop hadn't just been a nuisance, he had been a man with his thumb on the scales of several lives. He had the power to stop the vicar's dream, to expose a financial irregularity in the draper's accounts, or perhaps to discover something in the papers Lucy was filing that she would rather remain hidden. The village was no longer a collection of friends, it was a gathering of individuals with a shared relief that the obvious suspect was caught, and a shared fear that the truth might still be lurking in the wings. Miss Marple understood that the murder was not just an act of violence, but an act of preservation. Someone was trying to keep their world from falling apart, and they had used the theatre to do it. She reached her gate and looked back toward the village, her mind settling on the image of the blue jewel. It was a small piece of glass, but it was the key to a very large door. The following morning, the atmosphere of chipping Cleghorn took a sharp, jagged turn away from the relative peace of the previous evening. Just as the village was adjusting to the idea of Jerry Burton's guilt, a new and startling development occurred that threw Inspector Craddock's tidy timeline into utter disarray. It began when the village postman, making his rounds at the Blenkinsop estate, noticed that the heavy oak front door was standing slightly ajar. Upon entering to investigate, he found the study in a state of absolute upheaval. Filing cabinets had been pried open with a crowbar, and the floor was a white sea of discarded legal documents, as if someone had been searching for a single vital needle in a haystack of paper. This second crime, occurring while Jerry Burton was under constant police surveillance, sent a shockwave of renewed terror through the community. It effectively dismantled the theory of the lone, impulsive youth. A boy in a cell could not have ransacked a house 2 miles away. Inspector Craddock was forced to return to the village hall, his face a mask of weary frustration. He began to realize that the murder of Humphrey Blenkinsop was not the end of a story, but perhaps merely the opening act of a much larger and more desperate drama. The focus of the investigation shifted immediately from the physical act of the stabbing to the contents of those ransacked files. Miss Marple, hearing of the break-in through the rapid-fire delivery of the milkman, felt a cold sense of confirmation. She did not go to the estate. She knew the police would have it cordoned off. Instead, she took her seat in the tea room, observing the reactions of those around her as the news broke. She noticed Lucy Islesbarrow sitting alone in a corner, her usually steady hands trembling as she held a sugar tong. Lucy, who had been responsible for organizing those very files, looked not just shocked but profoundly frightened. It was a fear that went beyond the general unease of the village. It was the fear of someone who knew exactly what might have been stolen. "It is quite distressing, is it not, Lucy?" Miss Marple said softly, moving to the girl's table with a gentle, grandmotherly smile. "To think of someone treading through your hard work, tossing papers about. It must feel like a personal violation." Lucy looked up, her eyes wide. "It's not just the mess, Miss Marple. Mr. Blenkinsop was meticulous. He kept records of things that most people would have burned years ago. He told me once that information was the only currency that was never devalued. I'm afraid of what someone might do with what they found in those cabinets." "Information is indeed a dangerous currency," Miss Marple agreed, her voice remaining mild, "especially when the person who held the bank is no longer here to regulate the payments. It reminds me of the old schoolmaster in St. Mary Mead, who kept a diary of every boy's minor infractions for 40 years. When he died, the house was nearly burned down twice in 1 week." As they spoke, a second revelation emerged. The local locksmith, a man named Mr. Abernathy, arrived at the tea room with a tale that set the village buzzing once more. He claimed that 3 weeks prior someone had approached him to have a key duplicated from a wax impression. The client had been heavily muffled against the rain, but Mr. Abernathy was certain of one thing. The person had been wearing a very distinctive, high-quality mackintosh, identical to the one worn by the mystery man seen near the stage door on the night of the murder. This suggested that the break-in had been planned long before the play had even begun. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind connecting the dots with the precision of a master weaver. The blue glass jewel, the rubber-tipped cane mark, the duplicated key, and the ransacked files all pointed toward a perpetrator who was operating with a cold, calculated foresight. This was not a crime of passion or a sudden reaction to a threat. It was a strategic removal of an obstacle, followed by a desperate attempt to retrieve evidence of a secret that the victim had held over the killer's head. The twist lay in the realization that the killer had used the village's own expectations against them. By creating a crime that looked like a theatrical accident, they had hoped the police would focus only on the people backstage. The break-in was a necessary risk, taken only because the killer had failed to find the specific document they needed during the chaos of the blackout. Miss Marple looked at Lucy Islesbarrow and wondered if the girl was the next target, or if she was the person who knew the secret that the killer was so desperate to bury. The mystery was no longer about a body behind a curtain. It was about a hidden history that was being violently protected. The following afternoon, Miss Marple decided that the time for observation had passed and the time for a gentle yet firm confrontation had arrived. She did not seek out the police, nor did she make a grand scene on the village green. Instead, she made her way to the small, immaculately kept cottage of Mr. Smedley, the local draper and the man who had played the king. Mr. Smedley was a person of considerable self-importance, a man whose life revolved around the precision of measurements and the quality of fine fabrics. He was currently in his garden, meticulously deadheading his geraniums with a pair of silver-handled snips. Miss Marple paused at his gate, her knitting bag swinging gently from her arm. "Good afternoon, Mr. Smedley. Such a beautiful display. It quite puts my little garden to shame." The draper looked up, a thin, tight smile touching his lips. "Miss Marple, a pleasure, I'm sure. Though I must say the beauty of the flowers is little comfort in these dark times. The tragedy at the Hall has quite unstrung us all." "Indeed it has," Miss Marple agreed, stepping into the garden and moving closer to the flower beds. "It is the theatricality of it all that I find so distressing. To use a prop, a mere piece of make-believe, for such a dreadful reality. It reminds me so much of poor Mr. Spenlow in St. Mary Mead. He was a man who lived entirely for his stamp collection until someone discovered he had been creating his own rare issues. The pressure of maintaining a facade, Mr. Smedley, is often more than a soul can bear." Mr. Smedley's hand paused over a vibrant red bloom. "A facade? I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning, Jane. We are simple village folk here." Miss Marple reached into her pocket and produced the small blue glass jewel she had found in the wings. She held it out on her palm, where it glinted like a malevolent eye in the afternoon sun. "I found this near where poor Humphrey fell. It is a beautiful thing, isn't it? A bit of the king's robe left behind in the dark. It's a curious thing, but I recall Miss Weatherby saying how you insisted on so many alterations to that robe. She thought it was vanity, but I wondered if perhaps it was for concealment." The silence in the garden became heavy, the only sound the distant drone of a bumblebee. Mr. Smedley did not look at the jewel. He kept his eyes fixed on his geraniums. "I'm sure I don't know what you're suggesting. Costumes are often fragile." "Oh, quite so," Miss Marple said mildly. "But then there is the matter of the rubber-tipped cane. You've been using one since your indisposition at the play, have you not? A sudden onset of gout, perhaps, or perhaps a way to steady oneself while moving through a pitch-black stage in a heavy, unfamiliar garment." "It left a very distinct mark on the floorboards, Mr. Smedley. Almost as distinct as a signature." The draper's face remained a mask of polite indifference, but Miss Marple noticed a fine bead of perspiration appearing on his upper lip. She continued, her voice like soft velvet. "Humphrey Blenkinsop was a man of many files. He was also a man who had a very keen eye for financial discrepancies. I believe he was looking into the accounts of the Drapers' Guild, of which you are the treasurer. It must be so difficult, managing a business in these times, especially when one has developed a taste for the finer things in London. A secret like that would ruin a man of your standing." Mr. Smedley finally looked at her, his eyes cold and sharp. "You are an old woman with a vivid imagination, Miss Marple. These are wild accusations. The police have their man. Jerry Burton is a thief and a gambler." "Jerry Burton is a foolish boy," Miss Marple countered gently, "but he is not a performer. He did not have the presence of mind to don a king's robe to mask his height and gait in the shadows. He did not have the key to Humphrey's study, duplicated weeks in advance. And he certainly did not have the motive to destroy the evidence of a systematic embezzlement that Humphrey had finally uncovered. You see, Mr. Smedley, I watched your reaction when the news of the break-in arrived. You didn't look shocked. You looked relieved. You thought you had finally found the one ledger that could hang you." She watched him closely, her mind a steel trap waiting for the snap. She wasn't looking for a confession. She was looking for the twitch of the hand, the flick of the eye, the moment where the actor finally missed his cue. Mr. Smedley's knuckles were white as he gripped his gardening snips. He was a man balanced on a knife's edge, and Miss Marple was waiting to see which way he would fall. The village hall was draughty as the residents of Chipping Cleghorn gathered once more, though the atmosphere was far removed from the festive spirit of the opening night. Inspector Craddock stood by the stage, looking sceptical as Miss Marple sat in the front row, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythmic, inexorable certainty. She had requested this meeting under the guise of clarifying a few domestic details, and such was her reputation that even the chief constable had agreed to attend. The suspects were arranged like a cast awaiting a final critique, their faces pale under the harsh glare of the electric lights. "It is a curious thing about the theatre," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "It relies entirely on suspending disbelief. We see what we are told to see. We saw an ogre fall, and we saw a boy flee, and so we assumed the story was simple. But life in a village is rarely a simple play. It is more like a piece of intricate lace where one pulled thread can unravel the entire pattern." She paused, looking kindly at Jerry Burton, who sat slumped in a chair guarded by a constable. Jerry did not kill Mr. Blenkinsop. He couldn't have. He was too busy being terrified of his own shadow to orchestrate a murder that required the precision of a Swiss watch. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. "But the evidence, Miss Marple, the argument, the blood-stained cloth—" "Planted, Inspector, much like the clues in a cheap detective novel," she interrupted gently. "The real murderer did not want to just kill Humphrey. They wanted to be invisible while doing it. They knew that in the darkness of a scene change, a tall figure in a heavy robe would be ignored. They used the king's crimson robe, a garment so voluminous it could hide a man's true frame and even a rubber-tipped cane. This person knew that Mr. Smedley would be in his dressing room, incapacitated by a bout of indigestion that was in fact caused by a very precisely timed dose of laxative slipped into his pre-show sherry. A gasp moved through the room, and Mr. Smedley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the back of the hall. The crime began weeks ago when a key was duplicated. It continued when Lucy Islesborough was asked to repair the king's robe, providing a perfect excuse for someone else to handle it. But the jewel I found, the blue glass, was the one mistake. It fell not when the robe was being worn by the king, but when it was being used as a disguise by the killer to move through the wings undetected. They needed that disguise because, even in the dark, their own silhouette would have been far too recognizable. She stood up slowly, her eyes resting on Miss Weatherby, the director. The woman's face was like stone. You see, Humphrey Blenkinsop had discovered more than just Jerry's gambling. He had discovered that the London stage stars Miss Weatherby so often boasted of knowing were actually a front for a very clever and very illegal investment scheme she had been running, using the villagers' savings. She wasn't just a director, she was a swindler. When Humphrey threatened to take his files to the authorities, she knew her life of local prestige was over. She used her knowledge of the stage, the exact duration of the blackout, the placement of the props and the costumes, to commit the perfect theatrical murder. Miss Weatherby laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "You have no proof, Jane, just an old woman's ramblings about glass buttons and shadows. The proof is not in the hall, but in your garden, Henrietta," Miss Marple said with a sigh of genuine regret. "You ransacked Humphrey's study to find the ledger he kept on your investments, but you couldn't burn it in your fireplace without the neighbours noticing the unusual smoke, so you buried it beneath the new hydrangeas you planted yesterday morning. I noticed the soil was quite fresh when I walked past. And I believe the inspector will find that the mystery man's mackintosh, which you wore to the locksmith, is tucked away in the very bottom of your costume trunk, still smelling faintly of the damp earth from the estate." The silence that followed was absolute. Miss Weatherby's composure finally shattered, her face sagging into the lines of an old, tired woman who had run out of roles to play. She didn't scream or protest, she simply looked at her hands, the hands that had directed so many happy endings and now were destined for a much darker conclusion. Inspector Craddock signalled to his men, and as they led the director away, the villagers remained frozen, the reality of the deception slowly sinking in. The ogre was dead, the king was a pawn, and the director had finally been upstaged by the most observant member of the audience. The following week in Chipping Cleghorn was characterized by a peculiar heavy silence, as if the village were collectively nursing a bruised spirit. The posters for the ill-fated production of Puss in Boots had been stripped from the fences, leaving behind only patches of grey shredded paper that fluttered in the late August breeze. The village hall remained locked, its windows staring out like sightless eyes over the green where children had returned to their games. though they played with a little less noise than before. It was a time of quiet reckoning, as the residents struggled to reconcile the Henrietta Weatherby they had known, the tireless pillar of the dramatic society, with the woman who had cold-bloodedly calculated the end of a neighbour's life. Miss Marple sat in her small garden, the scent of late-blooming stocks filling the air with a cloying sweetness. She was engaged in the delicate task of pruning her lavender, her movements steady and purposeful. Across the hedge, she could see the vicar, Mr. Clement, walking slowly toward the church, his shoulders stooped as if the weight of his congregation's sins had become a physical burden. The parish hall extension would go ahead now, the legal threats having died with Humphrey Blenkinsop, but the joy that should have accompanied the project was strangely absent. It was the price of a life, even a difficult one, and the village felt the cost. Mrs. Bantry arrived just as the tea tray was being set out on the iron table. She looked tired, the excitement of the investigation having given way to a sombre reflection. For once she did not burst with news or questions, but instead sat quietly, watching the steam rise from her cup. "It's the waste of it all that bothers me most, Jane," she said eventually, her voice barely a murmur. Henrietta had such talent, such energy. To think she used all that brilliance to build a house of cards, and then used a knife to stop it from falling. Was it really just for money and a bit of local standing? Miss Marple snipped a withered stem and placed it carefully in her basket. "It is rarely just about the money, Dolly. It is about the image of oneself that one cannot bear to see shattered." Henrietta had spent 20 years cultivating the role of the village's leading light, to be revealed as a common swindler, to have the people she looked down upon pitying her. That was the one ending she couldn't write into her script. She killed Humphrey because he was the only person who saw through the costume to the person underneath. It is a very dangerous thing to take away someone's illusions. They sat in silence for a time, the distant chime of the church clock marking the passage of the afternoon. Miss Marple thought of Jerry Burton, who had been released with a formal police apology. He was back at the bank now, though he was much quieter, the shadow of the gallows having left a permanent mark on his youthful face. She thought of Lucy Islesbarrow, who had quietly moved on to another household, her efficiency undiminished, but her eyes a little more guarded. The ripples of a crime never truly disappear, they merely settle into the depths, changing the landscape of the floor below. "I suppose it reminds me of old Mr. Gabb from my childhood," Miss Marple continued, her blue eyes reflecting the fading light. "He was a man who took such pride in his perfectly painted fence. One day, a small boy accidentally scratched it with a hoop. Mr. Gabb didn't just repaint the scratch. He tore the whole fence down and built a stone wall so high no one could see his garden anymore. People often prefer a fortress of their own making to a world where they might be seen for who they truly are. Henrietta built a fortress of lies, and when Humphrey found the loose stone she felt she had no choice but to bury him under it. As the sun began to dip behind the elms, casting long purple shadows across the grass, Miss Marple felt a familiar sense of melancholy. She had seen the darkness in human nature so many times that it no longer surprised her, yet it never ceased to sadden her. People were so very much the same, whether in the grand houses of London or the cottages of Chipping Cleghorn. They were driven by the same fears, the same vanities, and the same desperate need to be loved or respected. She gathered her tools and her basket, the lavender giving off a final sharp fragrance. The mystery was solved, the murderer was in her cell, and the village would eventually forget the details of the body behind the curtains. But Miss Marple would remember. She would remember the blue glass jewel and the way the light had caught the falseness of the king's robe. She went inside to her quiet house, a small, frail figure who understood that the greatest dramas were often played out in the smallest rooms, and that the truth, however painful, was the only thing that could truly close the curtain.